together the idea of Hong Kong, it wasn't really on our radar, right? January. Everything was fine, hunky-dory in Hong Kong. It was only a month or two ago that things started to rise. And it really is right now the hottest front line for freedom. And I emailed lots of people in Hong Kong saying, please come to the conference. And everyone said, shucks, we'd love to, but we're busy right now. So, we got that message. But we're so delighted that Claudia Rosett, who's really one of the preeminent journalists, who's been documenting various fronts of totalitarianism, she's been in Hong Kong, and she is going to Skype with us. So there she, that's the webcam. So, can you what's been going on? You mentioned about Lam, the director there, just tell us from the beginning what it is that you've been seeing, and there's some new developments as far as new executive emergency orders?
Was the British seized it with basically from China in the 19th century in the Opium Wars. And China ceded in perpetuity the big rock that is Hong Kong Island and the end of the Hong Kong Peninsula, the Kowloon Peninsula. Those were British territories forever. That was the deal. And then Britain leased a big patch of land called the New Territories, which sort of completed the whole package in 1898 for 99 years. And when all this began, Hong Kong was nothing much. It was basically a fishing village. Under British rule, it turned into something quite spectacular as a British Crown colony, a big trading post, sort of important international center in Asia. Then it was pretty much destroyed by the Japanese invasion in World War II. They attacked Hong Kong just right about the same time they attacked Pearl Harbor. And it was liberated at the end of World War II. And then in 1949, China went communist. Mao declared the People's Republic. And Hong Kong's population, which had shrunk to 500,000 during the war, began to grow again as people fled China for a freer place. And that was the beginning of the really modern Hong Kong, where under British rule of law, and the British didn't want to have trouble running Hong Kong, so they made it a free port. They basically cultivated a culture here in which people had a lot of individual responsibility, and as long as they didn't have democracy, but they had a lot of the freedoms that go with it. And they were ruled by a British governor, and he reported to a democracy. Okay, they had a parliamentary system that ultimately the government was accountable to. The big change then came in 1984, when China had said it wanted Hong Kong back. Margaret Thatcher, who was a great prime minister, but this was not her finest hour, said okay, and signed a treaty called the Joint Declaration with China, Sino-British Joint Declaration, in which China promised that for 50 years after the British handed over Hong Kong, Hong Kong's people would keep their rights and freedoms they had enjoyed under the British. And they hammered out a basic law, a mini-constitution, that promised free elections here. There would be democracy. China would take care of foreign policy and national defense, but Hong Kong would run its own affairs with a, quote, high degree of autonomy. That was the promise. In 1997, the handover took place. I was here. It was not a happy occasion. Hong Kong's people were not thrilled to be handed to China. They had a very close front row seats to the 1989 slaughter that ended the Tiananmen uprising. But there wasn't really anything to do. They were never given the choice of self-determination. They were simply handed over from being a British crown colony to effectively becoming a colony of China, to be reabsorbed by China in the year 2044 when grace period runs out. Okay, then we're almost to where we are now. China began chewing away at Hong Kong's right freedoms pretty much from early days. There was a big threat in 2003 where one of the China-appointed chief executive, who would replace the British governor, basically, tried to put in anti-sedition laws. There were huge demonstrations in the streets, and he withdrew that proposal. In 2012, another chief executive tried to put in a patriotic education law that would have required all the students to be brainwashed in school. More big demonstrations, withdrawn again. At that point, Xi Jinping, the president, dictator for life of China, rose to power. And then you began to have real trouble. China was supposed to produce a system for Hong Kong to freely elect its own chief executive. Instead, what came down was a set of rigged rules in which Beijing called all the shots, basically decided who would be the candidates and appointed the chief executive after what was called a vote, but really wasn't a vote. And that sparked a huge protest movement, the Umbrella Movement, 5 years ago, where they occupied a central part of Hong Kong, went on for 79 days. The leaders were ultimately arrested. Some of them were jailed. If you've heard of Joshua Wong, a very young Hong Kong activist who's been in the streets recently, he went to prison. And for a while, it looked like sort of democratic protest had faded away in Hong Kong, that they were just giving up in the face of China becoming more and more overbearing. In 2018, a set of booksellers who read a little tiny bookshop in Hong Kong that sold sort of gossipy books about the Chinese leadership. These guys were kidnapped one by one and disappeared into China. And then one of them turned up making a confession on Chinese TV. It was getting more and more scary. I didn't change anything on my end. I've got a question. Are you guys hearing me all right?
Yep.
Okay. No, we're good. Okay. Anyway, then along comes 2019. And the current chief executive, a woman named Carrie Lam, who was appointed 2 years ago by Beijing, effectively appointed under Xi Jinping, decided to propose this bill that would allow extradition to China. In other words, China could say some Hong Kong citizen or anyone in Hong Kong, an American businessman, had violated Chinese law and should be extradited, and Hong Kong chief executive could decide to comply. This produced huge protest in Hong Kong, and Carrie Lam, the chief executive, simply plowed ahead with this thing. And they had that produced in June, a 1 million-person march. Now, the population of Hong Kong is 7.5 million, so that's a huge fraction of the population, turned out into the streets. It's the only way they have to negotiate in politics here. There's a rigged pro-Beijing majority in the Legislative Council. There's a Beijing-appointed chief executive. The courts have retained a certain amount of independence from British days. That is eroding as we go. Turning out in the streets is kind of what they're left with. They still had freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, and boy, did they use it in June. And Carrie Lam said, okay, I'll suspend the bill, but she didn't withdraw it. That produced more protests. And at that point, it really began to accelerate because people, look, in Hong Kong, they have a very sophisticated understanding of politics, of freedom. They're steeped in the institutions of democracy. They really understand freedom here. I mean, that's one of the amazing things that this culture has produced. Thanks partly to the British, partly to the people who fled China and set up their lives here. They wanted freedom. And what the Hong Kong people sort of then went to was the basic issue, which is unless they can choose their own leaders, they don't have a way to really defend themselves against Beijing. And they want free elections. So they came up with a set of demands. And this all just began to accelerate. Carrie Lam just wouldn't give in. Basically, the only concession was that this bill that should never have been introduced was suspended. And there it hung, for weeks and weeks and weeks as the demonstrations went on. And people tried everything. They tried peaceful protests. They marched peacefully through the streets. And finally, on July 1st, the anniversary of the British handover, came this violence where protesters broke into the Legislative Council building and trashed the chamber. It's a rubber stamp legislature, and they treated it that way. And at this manifesto, they defaced the emblem of that China has given to Hong Kong. And there was this shock here that something like this had happened. I mean, they bashed in the windows. They spent hours doing it. And finally, the police cleared them out late at night. And then Carrie Lam turned up at 4 in the morning and gave a speech, along with the chief of police commissioner, and gave a speech chewing everybody out. And from there, this just began to accelerate. Got Hong Kongers, as they call themselves, they say, what they're saying right now is, I'm not Chinese, I'm a Hong Konger. They equate Chinese with the Communist Party rule of China. And it becomes complicated. They will tell you they're not, in the main, they're not for independence. They know that's a third mile. But they want the high degree of autonomy they were promised. They want the free elections. They want the 50-year grace period. And China has been taking that away. And as these demonstrations have turned more and more violent, the screws have come down from Carrie Lam and Beijing. Beijing began issuing threats the language was over the top. Fire in the abyss. Hong Kong was staring into the abyss. And then out came the threat that if this went on, an emergency ordinance could be invoked that would allow the chief executive of Hong Kong to invite the People's Liberation Army to intervene. Now, the Chinese army has been garrisoned here since the handover, so there are thousands of Chinese troops in the city. It's just they usually stay in their barracks. They operate inside various camps they have around the territory. But suddenly there was this threat that they will go out and they'll restore order if invited to. Well, of course, since the chief executive basically dances to Beijing's tune, if Beijing wants her to invite them, it's a pretty good bet that she will. And this has gone on as the protesters have become more and more sophisticated in their techniques, and the police have become more and more violent in their treatment of people. There have been various confrontations where the protesters have sort of turned them into particular grievances. The storming into a subway car at the end of August where the police just beat people and pepper sprayed them in the face. And the protesters think that people may have died there. The government denies it. It's very hard to get any clarity on that. And I'm happy to go into details in a Q&A, but we get to the big break point that everyone was watching was October 1st, the National Day of China. The big fancy 70th anniversary celebration of the People's Republic of China, Mao's founding of the communist China. And this was something that we all knew. Xi Jinping, president of China, wanted to be just perfect. He didn't want Hong Kong distracting from the great day. So the betting was that nothing terribly drastic would happen before then. On that day, there were huge protests here, and these protests have been all over Hong Kong. It's not just the central island. It's been in the new territories, in Kowloon, in one place after another, in part because the government, having arrested the leaders of the umbrella movement 5 years ago, made it clear that if you are a leader of protests, you will go to prison. So the protesters here stopped having leaders. They crowdsource things. Through the internet, they're very tech savvy, and they're incredibly creative and industrious. The kind of energy that they put into building Hong Kong, they have been putting into these protests. They've written an anthem for themselves. I want to play that for you at the end of this because it is moving, it is haunting, it's about freedom. And there's an important thing to understand about the violence that you've been hearing about in the news. It's not random looting. Hong Kong is a place stuffed with fancy stores, and there has been nothing of that kind. They've gone by, they've attacked the protesters who have turned violent, and that's a portion of them. There are many kinds of protests going on here right now. There are peaceful people, there are middle-aged, there are old people, and some of the younger protesters have taken to defacing emblems, burning places that represent the government of China or connections with China. But there are messages in all this. In other words, it's not just sort of random violence. This is not Antifa. This is not European-style trashing of things. They have been going after emblems of China's rule. And it's been pretty specific. They've taken to burning stations of the subway, and what that means is they set up a pile of rubbish in the subway entrance and set fire to it. They haven't been burning the major subway installations so far, but they do that because the subway, the MTR, mass transit railway here, which is the arterial system of the city, has been it's majority owned by the government here. And it's been doing what the government wants to try and stop the protests. They shut down the stations to the protests. So you get on the subway to try to go to one, and it won't stop there. And that's why yesterday they shut down the entire MTR. Nobody could get anywhere on that system. Today, half of it was shut down. And the protesters have been calling it the communist railway, and have been attacking the MTR and its symbols. They've been scrawling graffiti all over Starbucks shop here. They're shuttered with big wooden panels, not because they've just a Starbucks per se, but because the Starbucks agent here is basically owned by someone who is a friend of the chief executive, and who went to the Human Rights Council of the UN and said that the protesters don't represent Hong Kong. Well, actually they do. This is a widespread, deep-seated movement, and there's a staggering support for it. The government keeps hoping that people become tired of the inconvenience and turn against it. That hasn't happened yet. And the sort of big thing that happened is that on Friday, just this past Friday, the chief executive finally made good on or carried through with the threat that's been hanging out there. There's an emergency ordinance that the British put in 1922. It had not been used since 1967 when they had communist riots during Mao's Cultural Revolution in Hong Kong. Carrie Lam invoked that ordinance, emergency powers. It gives her basically dictatorial powers in Hong Kong. She doesn't even have to go through the rubber stamp legislature. She can do it in blank check. She can pretty much do what she wants. And the first thing she did with this was put into effect a law banning face masks, which have been essential for Hong Kong protesters in two ways. One is to hide their identity from authorities who are not exactly going by any kind of predictable rule of law at this point. I mean, people are getting arrested for all sorts of reasons. They picked up a lawmaker on the eve of a big protest, August 31st. They was home at 11:30 at night with 10 policemen and in vans, arrested him, didn't charge him, clearly to intimidate. And part of it is people don't want their identities out there, especially given China's techno-surveillance state and the possibility that that will be used in Hong Kong. The other one is that the police have used incredible amounts of tear gas, and that's how many of these demonstrations end. And gas masks have become important. I mean, I've never in my life imagined that I would go out to see something going on and take along a gas mask, but that's what you really have to do here if you're anywhere near these things. And this is now banned. Well, they are now defying that. They marched today in huge numbers on both Hong Kong and Kowloon, wearing masks. So this confrontation just keeps escalating. Reuters had a very well-reported piece last week that the Chinese army's troop strength in Hong Kong has doubled from a few thousand to something like 12,000, as best can be estimated. So it's a cliffhanger. And the thing to know is that this isn't some sort of juvenile protest. This is not something where they're just randomly vandalizing things. This is a protest against the tyranny of China. This is a collision between a free society and one of the world's worst tyrannies, and certainly the world's most powerful dictatorship right now. The odds against Hong Kongers succeeding in defending their freedoms are very bad. I mean, and yet they are just persisting. They keep going, they keep going. The local phrase in Cantonese, they speak Cantonese here, not Mandarin, which is the mainland dialect, is Gaima, which means add oil. Keep going. A Cathay Pacific, their flagship airline pilot who said that in explaining to his passengers the protesters that they would run into at the airport in August, was fired from his job. People who support the protesters are being fired from jobs when China puts pressure on. And that's where we are right now. I've asked if AFA could play the anthem that Hong Kongers have written for themselves. An anonymous composer wrote it because to put your name out there is dangerous. And the lyrics were crowdsourced, as they've been doing so many things. And if you can play it, and then I'm happy to take questions.
Are we? Yeah. Don't lose her. If we could, I was just told that the 5 raising our hands in solidarity with you. Can we do that? 5 fingers spread. The webcam is right here.
What people here keep saying is fight for freedom, stand with Hong Kong. They keep saying that. It's what they were saying at the airport when they occupied that and met people getting off the planes. They've been trying to get any attention they can because they have no backup. They have no army of their own. Their own police are being used against them. They keep asking the international community, stand with Hong Kong, and fight for freedom. So, yeah. Anyway, happy to take questions.
We stand with Hong Kong. That was magnificent.
Do you think China will actually start to come in with their garrisons?
Their army is here.
To
They
fight.
actually with the 1997 handover, there used to be British troops based here. Chinese troops rolled into the territory that night, right after midnight, as the handover took place, and set up shop. They stay in their barracks, and they have sort of a number of places around the territory. One of them is right in the middle of central Hong Kong. I mean, right in the business district. If you know where it is, it's there. And so they're here. They don't usually come out. They stay inside their own strange lives in there. The threat is that they will emerge. The further threat is that more could come over the border. I think it's very possible they could do that. People have been saying for some time, oh, China wouldn't dream of doing that because it would be the end of Hong Kong, which is China's main financial interface with the world is Hong Kong. Okay, it's the foreign exchange window for China's highly controlled financial markets, currency. But so China has some interest in not destroying Hong Kong. At the same time, China's dictator, Xi Jinping, and Communist Party have a greater interest in simply keeping power. And if it comes to that, one of their concerns has been that that's not spread into China, where people are clearly there's potentially a problem for the Chinese dictatorship as well. How do we know that? Look at the measures they take to keep control, the degree of surveillance, the enormous security apparatus. That's how you keep people under control. And I guess I covered Tiananmen 30 years ago when I was based here in Hong Kong. And I think it's the same showdown, basically. It's the same conflict between people under the Chinese flag saying we want freedom, we want to be able to speak our minds, and we want to hold our government accountable. And China solved that problem. China's dictatorship solved that problem for itself 30 years ago by slaughtering its own people in the streets of its capital. I think that they would do that here if they feel that that's what they have to do to really gain control. It's a significant risk. Yeah.
First of all, thank you so much for this fabulous presentation. My question is, where does President Trump stand on this? And given all the complications of the relationship with China and the trade war, et cetera, if you could advise him, what would you suggest?
Well, two things. I think he gets too little credit for how he's dealt with China. Because whatever the complexities of the American debate over President Trump, he's turned around a trajectory that was very dangerous. A series of presidents have tried to engage with China, make nice with China, be buddy-buddy with China, and China has exploited that to the hilt. And what we have now is, especially, this really took off during the Obama administration. That was when Xi Jinping rose to power. That was when China began at speed building military bases, artificial islands in the South China Sea, military bases on top of those islands. That's meant for two things, basically. One is to retake Taiwan, which is the only other part of China that's free. Hong Kong and Taiwan are the two places that have not been dictatorships, that have had a free society. China wants to end that in both places. And the other one is freedom of navigation, the vital shipping straits that connect Japan with the Middle East and so on. China wants to control that. In fact, China wants the Western Pacific. This is dangerous because China is I would call it at this point a totalitarian state. It's not really communist, but it's become something actually slightly more dangerous. China got rid of the worst inefficiencies of communism. They're not trying to collectivize everything anymore, but they retained the power structures and this sort of completely ruthless party that has in place measures to control people's lives. So you have an incredibly controlling, brutal dictatorship that aspires to become a dominant world power. And America had been sort of giving this a pass for a long time. President Trump said no. And, I could argue the precise economics involved in his trade policies, but the fundamental position of we need to stop China allowed to get away with this anymore was a vital change in policy. And for that, I think he did America and our allies a great service. I hope he keeps going. It's important. On Hong Kong, he said various things. It's been a little hard to figure exactly where it comes out because he spoke up at the United Nations about the importance of China treating Hong Kong well. I mean, that was extraordinary. And again, that was great. He ended by saying that Xi Jinping is a great leader and he hopes he does the right thing. I don't think Xi Jinping is a great leader, but I would allow a little room for diplomacy and that when, compared to the nonsense one usually hears there, I was delighted to hear Hong Kong brought up. I think we also don't really know what's going on behind the scenes. And it matters that America has been leaning on China on theft of intellectual property, on, dirty tricks on trade, basically. Because the more pressure Xi Jinping is under to save his own bacon in China vis-a-vis the U.S., the more leverage potentially there is to say, don't destroy Hong Kong. So basically, I think President Trump has been doing a better job with all this than anything I've seen in a long time. But is it enough? The advice I would give is to speak up much more strongly and clearly and at every possible opportunity because Hong Kong is really, it's on the edge of a knife right now. And the thing I fear is that there's a point where where Xi Jinping in Beijing, the calculus will be Hong Kong is a sort of write-off anyway. So they might as well finish the job. In other words, the calculation what's always been the seesaw there is Hong Kong is a valuable asset for China, and they don't want to destroy that. And at the same time, Hong Kong is filled with 7.5 million human beings who actually, most of them, want freedom. They want what they were promised. And China is in gross violation of its treaty with Britain right now with this emergency ordinance and the rights it's been stripping away. But at some point, they're just going to say they don't care. It's the prime imperative for the government in Beijing is power. That's what the Chinese Communist Party is about. So anything that the rest of the world can do to say, don't do this. People here, if you ask, I asked a young man today, I've asked a lot of people, okay, this is the typical answer. What do you want America to do? And over, they say, please pass the Hong Kong Freedom and Democracy Act. This is an act that would strip away, if it turns out that China is not treating Hong Kong with a high degree of autonomy, that China's rules apply here, then it would require that the U.S. take away the special trading status that Hong Kong enjoys separate from China. Now that would Hong Kong. People here are so angry at China at the Chinese government, that they are saying, please pass this. Please put them under that threat. We're willing to pay the price. In fact, I'm talking to a lot of people here who are basically saying we're willing to die for freedom. And I know in my mind that sounds a little implausible. It's not. They mean it. I mean, they're taking huge risks to do what they're doing now. So my advice would be anything. You'll often hear, okay, don't jar China, don't insult China, let China save face. I'm sorry, no, there's a point where just saying it straight out, you must not do this, is important. I would also suggest China's planning to host the 2022 Winter Olympics. You might or have read about if you're young enough that the U.S. boycotted the 1980 Olympics in Moscow. If China does not back off on Hong Kong, I think it would be a very bad thing for the U.S. to send anyone to the 2022 Olympics. You know, there are things we could say there, but that would make a difference.
You just dealt with this a little bit, but has there been, or do you anticipate there might be any request for military or other aid from outside to Hong Kong? And should such a request come, what do you think would be the best thing for the United States and the rest of the West to do in such a situation?
You mean if people of Hong Kong asked for military aid here?
Yes. Or some other form of aid.
I think the answer to that one is it's virtually, it's almost certain that it would not be given by anyone. Here's the problem. In the defending of Hong Kong, it would be destroyed. It's a relatively small territory. China is the source of the water here. And that's the reason that Margaret Thatcher made the calculation and said, we're not going to try and defend this, even though Hong Kong Island and Kowloon, the tip of the Kowloon Peninsula, was supposed to be British in perpetuity. She gave it back because they said if it came to a military showdown, we couldn't defend the city and yet save it. We would lose it. So if the British were willing to do that when it was a crown colony, it's really unlikely that you say the U.S. would go to war to try to defend Hong Kong. It's much more likely, and I hope it's a certainty, that we would go to war to defend Taiwan, where you have a separate entity and it's sort of much more defensible. This is a trickier thing. This is something where military aid probably wouldn't work. However, threatening China more broadly has great possibilities. I would say it can't really be solved with a military conflict in Hong Kong, where some country comes to the rescue or tries to. But it can perhaps be solved, or at least the path where right now Hong Kong's freedoms are just being plummeting, being destroyed at an incredibly rapid rate. The thing that is probably most desirable and realistically might be achieved with great effort and care if we really all do stand with Hong Kong is to change the trajectory, is to get it back on some course where the freedoms are not going away at such a speed. And what you're hoping for in that time is that something changes in China. I think what would have to change would be the government of China would have to collapse. And that would be such a pity. But that's what needs to be done, because effectively it's a hostage negotiation. Okay, that's what's going on here. I mean, Hong Kong is dependent on China for some of its basic utilities, and at the same time needs to be autonomous enough to so that the free culture here is not simply crushed or suppressed. Or one of the things that they're spray painting on the walls and saying in the streets is today Xinjiang, the concentration camps where China is brainwashing whatever, an estimated 1 million Muslims, tomorrow Hong Kong. That's one of the things they're afraid of here.
Hello, I'm one of the United States Army retirees. I would like to know what you think about the South Korea right now. United States right now, please? Thank you.
South Korea
Well,
is run by a president who unfortunately is doing more to help Kim Jong-un than to help South Korea.
What's happening with the business community in Hong Kong? How many are actually leaving, staying? What's that whole mood, and how is it affecting what's going on?
Korea, right, the common problem, again, is China, the background, North Korea, the threat to Hong Kong and Taiwan. But the business community, right now, they're looking for Irish passports. They've moved tremendous amounts of money to Singapore is cashing in on this. It's a great bonanza for them because everybody's looking for someplace else to go. And they're in a real sweat. Business is doing terribly here right now. Everything's shut. The tourism industry is a disaster. If you don't mind tear gas, it's a great time to come to Hong Kong because the hotels are really cheap. They have a serious problem, and people with money are either already have passports or are looking for ways to get out. They're moving investments out of here. So there's on that front, a big problem, and what you could, if that isn't changed, if something doesn't sort of turn this around, basically you're seeing destruction of one of the world's great cities. It's a tragedy. And, but I think one important thing I want to just say, I guess, because as you hear news about Hong Kong, there's a lot of talk about, well, part of the problem here is economic discontent. All these people who can't get big and can't buy enough, room to live in and so on. Yeah, that is a problem because more and more you've had sort of a crony capitalism system emerge as the China gang has moved in here. But that's not what's motivating. I have not heard anybody protest for cheaper housing. They're protesting for freedom. They profoundly understand here that that's the basic principle and the rest follows. They want free elections so they can elect leaders who will then figure out what to do about housing policies. And what you have is a sort of crony business class that has been feasting off this golden goose for some time, and now they're in panic. So that's where that is. This is dreadful for the business community. My third is that China's calculation may be that in 1989, while the West was horrified by Tiananmen, China actually recovered, the economy recovered fine. The Communist Party did very well out of it. It was a hideous, monstrous thing, and it left China still a dictatorship that we all may pay a terrible price for. But they didn't pay an economic price, and they may be calculating that Hong Kong could come back. I think they're underestimating in Beijing the profound importance that freedom has played in building this place, and that's what's being lost. Anyway, thank you all. Thank you so much.
thank you. And know that we stand with Hong Kong. Thank you.